Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I would like to welcome you to FortneyScott's COVID-19 weekly briefing. These briefings are held every Monday and cover the latest topics and developments impacting the workplace with regard to COVID-19. This briefing will be recorded. Everyone who registered today will be registered for all future briefings. The weekly briefings will continue as long as circumstances develop with regard to COVID-19. I want to address some preliminary items before we start today's briefing. Currently, all listeners' phones are muted. At any point in time during the presentation, please feel free to submit a question in the GoToWebinar question box. We will try to answer all questions. Today's weekly briefing addresses the legal challenges employers are facing. The presenters include FortneyScott attorneys David Fortney, Elizabeth Bradley, and John Clifford. I will now turn the program over to David Fortney to start our weekly briefing.
Thanks, Adriana, so much, and welcome back to most of you. And we have some new attendees also, so we're really glad to have everyone. Let's start with some preliminary matters. First, an important notice about us. We, of course, are based in Washington, D.C. Our practice is focused exclusively on the workplace and primarily on the federal agencies that govern the workplace. So, of course, that's right in the bullseye of the developments that we're dealing with in COVID. Further, on the next slide, we talk a little bit about the purpose of today, which is informational only. Obviously, companies and your representatives, you should consult with either your in-house employment counsel or with outside counsel. We represent a number of you, but others, make sure that you go to someone specifically to ensure that your facts and circumstances are properly addressed when seeking legal compliance. So let's talk a little bit about the agenda and what we're going to cover today. As we typically do in these calls, we're going to kick off and spend the first part of the call talking about recent developments, and it never seems to fail, but in 7 days we always have more to talk about than we can cover in the allotted time. But we also want to really drill down and spend the bulk of today on a number of key legal challenges that employers are facing. We're going to talk a little bit about the pending discussions on liability claims and possible legal safe harbors. This may result in federal legislation. We're going to talk about wage and hour compliance, and we see a number of nudgy but significant issues involving the return to the workplace, particularly, and walk through some of those. We also want to talk about layoffs. Unfortunately, the many furloughs are evolving and becoming layoffs, permanent layoffs, and there are various legal obligations not only under the federal WARN but under different state laws, as well as potential EEO claims, and we want to highlight those risks for you. And then finally, we want to end with an area that we've been spending a lot of time on, which deals with the implementation of the new paid both sick and family obligations that have been a little bit vexing for a number of folks. So they're not as straightforward as we'd like. All right, well, let's talk a little bit on the next slide on what happened last week and hone in a little bit on recent developments and updates. First, more guidance. The CDC has issued guidances. Now, again, we keep using the word guidance. It is important. It is not a regulation. It is not per se a requirement. We have talked a lot about the OSHA general duty provisions, and as that is further clarified by the guidances and both by CDC as well as OSHA. So the most recent iteration of this is the CDC guidance, and there's been a lot of public discussion about that the CDC, according to the press reports, had developed very detailed guidance. They ultimately were not authorized to disseminate that detailed guidance. That would have honed in on very specific workplace issues. What was issued, though, was rather more modest, but they have general flow charts, and they have focused on 6 sectors, and they're spelled out for you. Workplace, generally, general workplaces, as well as other work settings, restaurants, youth programs, childcare, mass transit, and others. But what these are, and obviously if your business or customers are involved in any of these specific sectors, you should look at that sector. But I think most of us are in the workplace sector. We've given you the link there so you can go right on to the CDC website and find these immediately. But let's look briefly at the workplace guidance, since that's what I think covers for most people. On the next slide, we go through you can go on the website and see this more clearly, but this is representative of what each of the 6 sectors are issued for. And you will see that basically it is a gating concept. So it's the same thing as the general guidelines that were published before. But the gating concept includes steps that you're to go through. First of all, should you even consider opening? And you'll see there's a short checklist there. You know, are you permitted under local requirements, et cetera? Well, many people, certainly if they haven't already, most locations within the next 15 to 20 days are going to be authorized to reopen. And then you move into, okay, before we open, are the recommended safety and health practices in place? And there's a nice, these again are fairly general, and I would suggest to you that this, we've talked before about the importance of developing a specific plan. This is a framework. These are the topics that need to be addressed. So I would almost treat this in developing a plan, and when we counsel clients, I treat this like, if you will, the table of contents, what I would expect, and think about each check mark would have perhaps a tab or some analysis and discussion. But you go through, you know, have you restructured, are things ready? And note that you have to, according to the CDC checklist, meet each one of these components. Otherwise, if any are no, you should not proceed. Assuming that you get to yes, you've trained employees, you've modified travel, you've modified workplaces, you've explained what social distancing looks like in your workplace, you put hand washing of other appropriate stations in, then at that point, per the CDC guidance, you've done the preparatory work, you're ready to reopen. And then the question is, you know, are you ready now to actually implement? Are you going to have a monitor? So this becomes a whole new thing. In some white-collar offices, your monitor might be your receptionist. We're not necessarily talking about creating a new position to be a monitor, but it could be a floor steward. If you're in a manufacturing setting, it could be someone that has sufficient real-time eyes and presence to help remind people about that. Do you have the protocols in place if you're going to be screening people or a problem comes? What are you going to do if you have someone who's positive, either that has positive symptoms or reports that they've been that outside the workplace have tested positive? We're going to talk a little bit later about temperature controls and all those metrics, but it's not only putting those in place, it's understanding how you deal with those if you do that. So the thought is that all of that is arranged too. Then and only then are you at the point where you should say, yes, we're ready to open. One final thing I'll say on that, we've talked a lot about this, is the importance of communicating, and these, I think, make that point nicely. And the communication is both in advance, and, you know, not only within your multi-subject matter team, we've talked about this, but also to the employees so they know what to expect. Very few people, if any, are going to go back to the workplace that existed on March 1. That is not going to be there. If it is there, that should be a flag, honestly, at this point. If it's simply, we'll send the cleaners in, they'll just dust off the desk, we're going to put everyone back, you're not ready. All right. Anyone have anything on that one?
You covered it well.
Okay, all right. Well, let's talk about one of the other milestones that happened on Friday. And in the next slide, we detail out the House of Representatives was back in session, and they did enact what is called the HEROES Act. And that's the Health and Economic Recovery Omnibus Emergency Solutions Act. Everything has to have an acronym, but the HEROES Act. This is a $3 trillion funding bill. Even in the COVID era, that's a very big number. It interestingly was not a straight party line vote, either in favor or against. One Republican, Peter King in New York, voted for it, and several Democrats peeled off and voted against it. Basically, in the political context, midweek last week, the White House issued a Statement of Administrative Position, or SAP, a SAP as it's known, in which it articulated that the bill as presented, the president's advisors will recommend that he veto it. That is a part of the art of the how legislative process works. When you issue a statement of administrative position, it says we will veto it. There's no question that's all been cleared off. In that, the president stakes out the position that other things need to be included and addressed in a comprehensive bill that are lacking in the HEROES Act, and including liability safe harbors and some other issues. Let's talk briefly though, but in response, Leader Pelosi has said, well, this is an opener. I mean, we're not saying this has to be our bill, but this is an opener. And I think as we sit here today, Monday the 18th, it looks like the parties are slowly beginning to talk. So let's look briefly at the next slide, and we'll talk a little bit about what the starting point is going to be. So think about negotiations are opening. Pelosi et al., the House majority, is going to the Senate saying, here's what we think is important. And the Senate hasn't yet responded formally, but they've responded informally, and we're going to talk about one of those key elements. But this is the wish list. This is the priorities as the House sees them. More funding for state and local governments, and that includes supporting fire, safety, other emergency services. There is a big issue there because the Republicans are saying many states were in a deficit situation before COVID hit, and we're not going to use this as an excuse to bail them out. They were irresponsible, and they're on their own. So how that gets bridged, we'll see. More stimulus money, more checks, up to $1,200. A so-called HEROES Fund. Everything has an acronym. It's DC. But to really underwrite additional pay for medical workers and others. Rent and mortgage aid. So this is really the whole focus, not the whole, but the primary focus of the HEROES Act and the Democratic proposal is, how do we take care of people that are not working? How do we bridge them? You'll hear the Republicans' response is more, let's talk about how we incentivize and get people back to work and how we make that more easily achieved economically. So the answer probably isn't one or the other, and it'll be a mix, but they start from those two respective points. Obviously, the Democrats going on down the wish list, more money for virus testing and contact tracing, upping the $600 UI kicker. That expires in July, and they would propose that would run through the end of this year. So that's the opening bid in Congress. There have been hearings. We'll talk a little bit about those on what the response may look like, but that's the opening, and it's a strong opening. It is a very expensive opening, but we'll go from there. All right. Well, there was more than just Congress working. Also, OSHA, they were busy too. Recall, OSHA does not have a regulation dealing with COVID in place. They're relying on guidance. And this past week, OSHA issued a number of guidances, as detailed there, for different industries. Certainly, if you are in one of these industries, nursing home, long-term care, pharma, the ride share and taxis, etc., you need to, and obviously manufacturing, you need to look at these guidances promptly, because this builds on the general duty and the general guidance that we have talked about multiple times in these discussions, and I hope you're familiar with at this point. Note that the manufacturing is actually a joint effort, and this seems to be what's happening. OSHA and CDC are becoming more intertwined, and I think that is helpful. But for any of you that are in these sectors, certainly looking at this, we do anticipate that more industry guidance will be forthcoming from OSHA. OSHA is under a huge amount of pressure to put forward more guidance. There is going to be a congressional hearing next week. The House is having the principal deputy administrator, that there is not a political, she's a senior career person. Lauren Sweat is her name. And she spent about 15 years working on the House committee dealing with health and safety. for the Republicans. She is a genuine subject matter expert. She knows both the nuances of OSHA and she knows the nuances of her former committee, who for the first time she will be appearing in front of on Wednesday. One of the themes at that committee is going to be a number of members beating on her, figuratively, not literally, speaking, saying, why aren't you issuing guidance? Why don't you issue guidelines? Why isn't that coming? And that's one that, interestingly, some Republicans are saying, we would like you to issue guidance also. So far, Secretary Scalia, Labor Secretary Scalia, has refused. He believes that guidance is the better approach. And Secretary Scalia now has a full seat at the table on the COVID task force. The Vice President's office announced on Friday that Secretary Scalia now is formally, I should say, a member of the COVID recovery task force. And I think that reflects the focus on unemployment, getting people back to work, what that begins to look like. OSHA is a component of that, but we're going to see the DOL piece now start to get more attention, certainly at the White House level, as these programs are rolled out and developed. All right. Well, that's kind of last week in a nutshell, the highlight reel. Let's talk a little bit about some of the key legal challenges. And I'm going to, on this one, because it's kind of a continuation, I'm going to cede the floor to myself initially, only briefly. Let's talk about the first one, please, which is this legal safe harbor. On last week, the Senate Judiciary Committee, and that's chaired by Senator Lindsey Graham from the great Palmetto State that Liz Bradley hails from, held a hearing, and it raised the question. They weren't looking at a bill, but it raised the question of the legal safe harbor. And the growing question, and I mentioned before that the President, a statement of administrative position, the veto threat, expressly had a red line provision. Red line. If we don't get this, we're not going to sign any new bill. One of the red line provisions is this provision, that there needs to be a legal safe harbor, that there needs to be some understanding, some appreciation that if employers in good faith comply with OSHA guidance and the requirements, that they should not be subject to being sued. Others take a different view and say, no, there really should be general state tort liability, class action liability. That, in fact, provides incentives for employers to be very careful to take all steps necessary. Kind of the counterpoint on that is, well, but if companies do their best and they potentially face claims from employees, they face claims from customers, business invitees that come in and allege they got sick there. They face claims from people who use their products or services downstream, and if they're a supplier. And people are saying, increasingly, businesses are saying, we are concerned about coming back, that we don't know if we're going to get sued. And you know what? It's not worth it for us to open up, try our darndest to get everyone back. We took PPP, we did all this, and then we got sued, we just got wiped out. And that has a certain appeal too. So the kind of the push-pull on this. One of the issues involves workers' comp and what the impact would be on workers' comp. And Liz, I know that's something you've looked a little bit at.
Yeah, and thank you, David. One of the things that often employers are protected because a tort claim can't be brought when the illness or the injury is covered by workers' comp. But then the question is, are COVID-related illnesses going to be covered by workers' comp? And there's a lot of interplay in the states with that about how they're defining or how they're going to treat COVID-related illnesses under their systems. A number of states have already said that COVID-related illnesses will be workers' comp covered when it comes to primary care providers. It's fairly an obvious and an easy step. But now California has taken a much broader step, and of course it's California. They lead on some of these types of issues. On May 6th, by executive order, the governor claimed that there is a presumption that COVID-related illnesses are work-related and covered by workers' comp if the employee tests positive within 14 days of performing work for the employer obviously outside the individual's home. That is a rebuttable presumption, so the employer has 30 days to come forward with evidence or information to show that they could have contracted the COVID in other related manners. Illinois previously tried to take this broader step and have it covering all employees. The Illinois Act was faced with legal challenges, and they ultimately repealed it rather than push forward and try to forward it in. But so right now, California could be subject to challenge. It has, based on information we have, it has not been yet. But I think that's going to be one of the next places it's going to be that we need to be monitoring and watching and seeing how does each state define their workers' compensation illnesses, and is it covering COVID-related matters?
Right. Because workers' comp typically provides a shield against tort claims. Although if you have gross negligence, reckless indifference to the health and safety, in many states you can actually still bring a tort claim that would circumvent. Workers' comp is important because it's an insured risk. It's a risk that businesses have built into their cost structure. These types of tort claims typically are very difficult to insure against and defend against. One of the issues that came up in Senator Graham's hearing last week, and it was interesting. We had Senator Klobuchar and Senator Graham. Now, they don't typically agree on much. They agree having guidance alone doesn't really work very well. Senator Klobuchar said, well, look at the guidance. CDC's been all over the place. First, they said don't wear PPE or a mask. Now they're saying wear a mask. We can't rely on guidance. Senator Graham is saying, well, guidance isn't helpful because it's not specific enough and you don't have that regulatory defense. That is a safe harbor. You can defend saying, I did everything the regulation required. I met the requirements, therefore you shouldn't be able to bring a claim against me. These issues, as they get sorted out, and whether federal law would preempt or supersede state law, present some very difficult constitutional challenges. Reminder, those of you may recall, and after September 11th, we had a number of folks, principally the victims on airplanes and as well as on the ground. They wanted to bring state tort claims, and there was a question as to how you could have a uniform federal law to deal with that. So they created the September 11th compensation fund model. It was funded with federal dollars. It was put in, but it wasn't mandated, so there wasn't formal preemption. And in order for a claimant to participate in that, they actually had to sign a waiver of all those various state claims they might have brought to go forward into the federal system. That model's been dusted off again and being looked at. Maybe there should be a COVID compensation fund model that still would, under federalism concepts, allow the state tort claims to be there, but the majority of people, it's believed, would focus like they did after September 11th. We don't know. But these issues are going to be, for the lawyers on the call, in the next 2 to 3 weeks, these issues are going to get really close attention and be sorted out pretty deeply. All right. Well, let's move to wage hour and talk a little bit about that because, and Liz, I'm going to ask you to kick that off for us because that is one of the more challenging areas that we're finding also, the laws that are on the book, how to comply with those. Forget the new ones.
Exactly. So with regard to wage and hour considerations, there are changes that are happening in our workforce, and they're potentially resulting in everybody's trying to save money, come back to work, to workplace. And we want to be careful that we don't step afoul of many of the wage and hour concerns. And we're going to start here. This first slide, we're going to talk about some of the things that impact your non-exempt workforce. And a lot of people, and this goes back to what are your recommendations for coming back to work? Are you having your employees doing temperature checks? Are you asking them to fill out those questionnaires? And you should be. But how does that impact what is compensable time and how do you pay your employees? So let's think about this. You have your employees coming and they have to do a temperature check and they're standing outside the doors of the building. How long are they standing there? Is that compensable time that as they stand in queue trying to come in? And how long does that take? The questionnaires, another thing. Often these questionnaires, one portion of it is it asks people to track their temperature. And that's asking what is their temperature outside of the workforce. And these are their workday. So you're tracking these forms, and it is required for them to come into the workplace. So is it compensable time? And the great lawyer answer is it depends, right? So thinking about is under FLSA, thinking about those bag check cases, which have gone both ways. But I think that there is support under the FLSA that it is potentially not compensable time. But that's just the starting place. What about your state and local laws? I think, and I don't mean to pick on California, but I think if you're looking at this under California state law, this is going to be compensable time. So that is something that everybody needs to be looking at about how the duration of that, the burden of these questions, and whether it's compensable. Because then that leads us into even the greater question of, okay, so you decide it's compensable. How are you going to compensate for that time? Back to the example of the employees in a queue outside. They're clearly outside of the clock. They haven't clocked in yet. How are you going to accurately track that time? You're going to have some logistic solutions. Are they going to be filling out a report when they get to their desk or their workstation to say how long it took from the end of queue to start time? How do they report that to their HR or the payroll system? How are you going to bake that in to your quality check and your certification of the payroll and that it is accurate? There's a lot to think about here and how you're going to be doing that. Another option that we've had some employers are looking at is doing an estimated payment. So they're estimating that it takes approximately 15 minutes to get through the queue, or in a week it takes about 15 minutes to fill out this questionnaire. And they're just automatically paying everybody for an additional 15 minutes per shift. So that's one great way to do it. Make sure you need to walk through the process, keep records of how you walked through that process. How did you come up with those 15 minutes? You're going to need to make sure that you have a sort of a paper trail, because if somebody brings a claim saying that they were not properly compensated, you need to be able to defend those decisions and what those calculations are. And another thing, just to bake more onto this, is are you automatically walking into overtime? So if you have a workforce that is currently scheduled for 5 8-hour shifts in a day, any additional time that they spend doing COVID-related pre or post-work activity is automatically clicking up to over 40 hours in a work week, and you're automatically going into overtime. So a consideration you may want to do is drop down reallocate your scheduling. So if they are currently on 8-hour shifts, if you switch to a 7.5-hour shift, for example, that bakes you in a half hour in which these activities can be done, so that you're not going into that very expensive overtime considerations. David and John,
another nuance on that is, I was going to say another nuance would be, it's one of the recommendations in bringing people back that you try to stagger shifts anyhow. One additional benefit, in addition to allowing greater social distancing when people are there, is that if you're doing these preliminary at the door checks, you reduce the queue, the backup potentially if you have people on staggered start times. So just another practical point. Well, let's talk to us a little bit about salaries and what people are doing on that front, please. Next slide. Thank you.
Yep. So the next set of slides we're going to be talking about is going to be focused on your exempt workforce, because often they get a little bit ignored, right? So we think they're exempt, we've got them protected, we know what we're doing with them. But there are things that some employers are doing that you may end up losing that exemption. So we're going to walk through some examples of that. The first is reduced salaries. So we've worked with some of our clients who are doing across the board salary cuts, 10%, 15%, some as much as 20%. And that is it's a great neutral selection, so everybody is being cut the same amount so that you're not walking into any sort of discrimination type claims, but are you walking into a misclassification claim because you lose the salary basis test? So under the FLSA, the first test to make sure somebody is an exempt employee is, are they paid at a minimum, and this is for the executive, administrative, professional, and computer exemptions, this minimum of $684 a week or the $35,568 per year. That is your baseline. You have to be making at least that amount of money to be qualified as exempt. I also have here on the slide is a highly compensated exemption if you're relying simply on the compensation level. So if you are cutting salaries, you need to make sure that you do not cut below the $35,568 so that you don't lose your exemption. And you have a couple options there, and just caveat here, check your state and local laws as well, because like I said, this is the federal baseline. States and local laws provide for a higher baseline. So you don't want to preserve your federal exemption while losing your state exemption. That doesn't help you. So you've got some considerations here. So if you're going to do across the board 15% cut, you can the concept of red circling. So if anybody is going to drop below that, it's 15% or down to $35,568. So you can preserve that exemption by limiting the reduction for that workforce. Now, one thing to think about that is going to create a salary compression issue. Keep that in mind, because as you come out of COVID-related illnesses and as the workforce gets stronger and you're able to bring people back up, you want to be looking at making sure that you do not continue that salary compression and that you right-size that as you start increasing salaries back up. Another option is to convert those individuals who are going to drop below the $35,568 down to non-exempt. That's a big option, and it's going to be a very substantial change for those employees. Converting a salaried employee down to non-exempt, they would then be paid for all hours worked. They would be entitled to overtime, so you need to look at what their schedules are. How do you monitor that? And also, there's always significant personnel and morale issues when you are converting people from exempt to non-exempt. So those are some things to be thinking about as well.
Good. Well, let's talk briefly, because we're close on time, about reduced schedules and salaries. I think a lot of this on the next slide has been covered. About the prorating. Just touch briefly on the notice requirement, because that's...
Absolutely. So another thing is that employers are reducing exempt employees' salaries by saying, or schedules, saying, you're going to come in part-time or sharing jobs, where I'm coming in Monday, Wednesday, Friday, John's in Tuesdays, Thursdays, and they are prorating our salary based on the reduced work schedule. You can do that, but you got to do it right. You cannot just automatically take a prorated reduction of their salary. You have to do it in advance. So provide the employees with advance notice of what their new salary is, and look at your state and local laws. A lot have mandatory that you provide written notice. There's timelines of when you have to provide that notice. And again, make sure when you are doing that reduction that reduced salary still meets the federal, state, and local minimum salary requirements.
Thanks. One thing I'd note, while you're doing the next slide, is those that have received PPP payments are permitted, to reduce salaries by 25%, but still qualify for paying the current salary. They're allowed to reduce the salary. That being said, the PPP authorization does not override all the points that Liz has just covered with you that are in the FLSA and their counterpart state laws. So some people, I think, are sort of carried away with, well, PPP said I could reduce by 25%. Well, yeah, you can, but you don't want to run afoul of these other components. Okay.
Correct.
Talk briefly about job duties, Liz, because this is another nuance that we're seeing.
So, and this is another issue of, again, and a quick refresher, To be exempt, there's two parts of that test. It's a salary basis. We've just covered that one. And the second is the job duties, your primary duties. So we are seeing that people are coming back, reopening their workforces with a reduced workforce. Somebody has to do those jobs. So there's reallocation of job duties in order to get the work done. You have to be careful when reallocating non-exempt job duties to your exempt workforce, because it could result in them no longer being their primary duties, that now may no longer be the exempt. A great example right now is the computer exemption, which is, I think a lot of people have struggled with who qualifies as exempt under the computer exemption. But say your IT manager, clearly exempt, but you choose to come back with a reduced workforce of the help desk personnel, because your IT manager can also problem solve. And with this, I know I'm calling our IT department a good bit, getting myself set up in remote, and other people are making those phone calls. So your IT manager may spend a predominant amount of his day answering those help desk calls. Well, now he's not primarily performing his manager duties. He's not primarily doing the application of systems and developing a software. So one of our recommendations is a best practice when you are bringing back a reduced workforce and you're looking at who to allocate assignments to, keep that line. Exempt employees can pick up the other exempt job duties. Non-exempt employees should be picking up the other non-exempt job duties, and try to keep a clean line there so that you don't inadvertently lose your exempt classification for those employees.
Good. And go ahead, John.
Liz, I was just going to say, note that another area that we think people should keep an eye on is for the executive exemption. One of the key parts of that test is whether that employee supervises at least 2 people on a regular basis. I think certainly in possibly smaller retail environments or smaller office environments where the workforce wasn't that big, with possible job cuts, as we'll be discussing in the next slides coming up, make sure that those managers are still supervising at least 2 people. If for whatever reason the workforce has been cut, possibly they're only supervising 1 person on a few days a week, they may not hit all the requirements of that test. So it's something to keep an eye on.
Good.
Absolutely. Very good point.
And just we'll speaking of changes in workforce, I want to talk about, but let's move to layoffs. I'm going to ask John if he'd lead that discussion. While we're getting there, just point out a practice pointer to what Liz just laid out for us. The FLSA regulations do talk about if you spend 50% plus of your time doing one duty, that's presumed to be your primary duty. So that provides it's not a legal safe harbor, but it's pretty good. So if you're tooling around with people, if you can keep them at least at 50% plus doing exempt work, depending on which exemption you're under, you should still be in good shape, even if you peel back what they were previously doing. So, okay, good discussion. Thank you. John, let's talk about furloughs and what we're seeing, because sometimes these do become layoffs, which present.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure as everyone has seen in the news, there's been a lot of people getting either furloughed or laid off. And actually the latest jobs report, U.S. jobs report that came out earlier this month, found that of the 20.5 people that were laid off in April, actually almost 80% of those were temporary furloughs. So it appeared at the time, at least, to be a bit of a silver lining. Those people were expected to make their way back to work. But what we're seeing now is, as this pandemic is continuing drops in demand, that's causing businesses to have to review and restructure their workforces, and in a lot of cases make additional payroll cuts. So what has been happening, and we expect will continue to happen, is some of those what were initially temporary furloughs, however, will be either extended or at some point become permanent layoffs. We've already seen this hit the manufacturing, retail, hospitality industries hard. MGM is an example. They have 63,000 worker workforce. They announced that furloughs were being extended, not knowing when they expected, if they will be expected back. Retail, J. Crew, Neiman Marcus have been shutting down locations. Manufacturing, Goodyear, one of their plants was shut down. So this is happening across the board where, this isn't, as everyone knows by this point, it's not just going to be a few weeks. This is dragging on, and it's having those effects. So what we want to discuss today is if you are moving towards those layoffs or employers are moving towards permanent or extended layoffs, what obligations they have and how to approach those and to avoid liability. So if we could roll to the next slide. And so the first thing that we want to discuss is the WARN obligations under WARN here, specifically the notice requirements. For covered employers and covered events, it requires a 60-day notice to go out to employees preceding a layoff. Covered employers in this case being employers with 100 or more employees, that's full-time employees. And under WARN, that means that they're working on average more than 20 hours a week, or that they've been working at least 6 of the last 12 months there. So it's important to understand when that snapshot is taken. In this case, it would be at the time that this notice would be provided. And counting these, who to be counted, Liz, I know you wanted to touch on, because this will go hand in hand with some of the other regulations that we're dealing with, how to count these as well.
I think what we're going to talk about a little bit later is counting employees for the paid leave. And I think an important caveat here is you're counting your employees for WARN purposes. You do include employees on layoff and furlough status if there's an expectation to return to work. So those individuals are counted for your WARN notice. And you're going to hear me talk about this in a few minutes. On the paid leave, those employees are not counted. So it's important that you keep a cheat sheet somewhere that tells you how to count and when to count and who's included, so that you understand what your what threshold you are at different times.
Okay.
And if presuming an employer is covered here, that they meet that 100 employee count, we wanted to give a quick refresher on what does trigger these notices. A lot of people, a lot of businesses haven't had to deal with these frequently, and now are being forced to. So if they have 100 employees and they meet that standard, notice is required for either a plant closing or a mass layoff. Plant closing, I just want to focus on for a second, despite the name as it's written in the statute there, is not only for manufacturing plants or typical sort of union settings, but any work site, facility, even an operating unit within a work site. If that is being closed and it affects at least 50 full-time employees, that would be a triggering event where notice is required. Another situation is even if a site is not being closed, but there is what's called a mass layoff, which can either be over 500 full-time employees at a single site being laid off, or on a much smaller scale, if it's over 50 employees, but that makes up at least a third of the workforce at a single site. Again, that would trigger that notice requirement. And if it doesn't all have to be in one day. I just want to touch on this is over a 30-day period. So if companies are dealing with sort of rolling layoffs, you have to keep that 30-day window in mind. Next point that I think is very relevant to what a lot of companies are dealing with now, and is that furloughs, even if they extend past 6 months, even if temporary, can also trigger these notice requirements. And as we're seeing on this next slide, dealing with COVID-19 layoffs here, is that there is an exception to the 60-day notice requirement for unforeseen business circumstances. A lot of businesses are asking, does this apply to the current situation with COVID-19? Certainly this pandemic a few months ago, likely no one would have foreseen this. The answer is, does this apply today as businesses are extending these furloughs or as they're converting them to permanent layoffs? Again, I know Liz had to refer to this earlier. The answer is, yet again, it depends. But we believe that the longer an employer waits at this point, the less likely they would be to prevail on this point. Certainly since March, we've been seeing employers have a little more notice that this is a likelihood. And in fact, there have been several lawsuits filed already specifically on the notice requirements. Class action plaintiffs arguing that employers had the information necessary to provide them with notice. They knew either extended furloughs or layoffs were a likelihood. So
okay,
based on, so we would just recommend, yeah, absolutely. Employers should look into providing notice as soon as possible or consulting someone on that. And we can jump to the next slide here. And I'll just quickly touch on the fact that many states do have their own sort of mini WARN acts that they have different, in some cases, different thresholds, notice periods. Compliance with the federal WARN Act does not necessarily guarantee that you will be compliant with the state requirements. So we certainly advise that you, depending on where you're located, look into the state requirements, make sure that you, if you are in that situation, are compliant with both the state and federal requirements. And moving on from WARN, a couple other issues that do come up on the next slide here as we're dealing with layoffs. One is certainly avoiding potential disparate impacts in these layoffs as you're converting to layoffs from furloughs potentially. If there are groups, if you even randomly select a group here and they have a disproportionate impact on protected groups, employers may be facing discrimination claims under federal law, whether it's Title VII, ADEA, or ADA, or comparable state or local EEO laws. We certainly, sort of a best practices here, a couple points. Employers should carefully determine what are the legitimate factors for determining which positions to eliminate. Certainly reliance on objective criteria where possible is something we advise. And before moving forward with any of these layoffs, just conducting a disparate impact analysis, making a determination whether there is a disproportionate number of employees from any one protected group that is included in the selected employees that are being laid off. Just a practice point here as a reminder, we of course advise that you conduct any of those analyses under attorney-client privilege moving forward. So exactly, and we can jump to the next slide.
Yeah, so if we have releases, what do we need to keep in mind?
So this is just a point we wanted to mention. That it can be sort of a gotcha point that if you aren't sort of dot your I's and cross your T's here, you can get stuck on, and that's if you're using separation agreements that include release of claims. We want people to make sure they pay attention to the OWBPA, the Older Workers Benefit Protections Act, and the requirements that go along with that. Now, typically, if you're looking for a release of ADEA claims, the OWBPA would impose certain requirements in order to secure those releases. What do the separation agreements have to entail? When you're doing a group layoff, which in this setting, believe it or not, is more than one employee. So if you are doing 2 or more employees, it is considered a group layoff under this statute. It requires extended notice and consideration periods to secure those releases. So even if you have secured ADEA claims for a single employee in a separation agreement, it entails extra requirements when dealing with a group layoff circumstances that a lot of employers are facing now. Specifically, longer consideration period, I mentioned 45 days as compared to only 21 days for a single employee. And you also have to include certain disclosures, including the decisional unit, meaning the group at the business that was reviewed for eligibility in the layoff, what the factors were that were considered, time limits, the job titles and ages of the selected individuals who are being laid off, as well as those who are not being laid off. And again, we just want to point out that these are things that readily available information, but people often don't have them in there. If you're using a standard form agreement, it may not be included in there. So we want to make sure that you review it with that in mind, include everything that's needed so you don't get stuck on that.
Thank you, John, because these are legally non-waivable requirements, so we want to make sure that you meet all of them. Well, I'm going to call on Liz in a moment on talk about some of the paid leave nuances. I want to clean off a question, though, that came in during this, and actually goes back to some OSHA questions. What impact will the AFL-CIO lawsuit have to force OSHA to issue an emergency rule? This goes with the pressure, and this is part of an orchestrated, the AFL-CIO has filed a lawsuit. It's kind of a precursor to the issues that are going to be covered this Wednesday at the House hearing. It goes hand in glove. It's part of the orchestrated stepping up the pressure on the Labor Department. I think as a practical matter, though, it's highly unlikely that that lawsuit in and of itself will result in the Labor Department being ordered by a judge to issue a standard. I wouldn't bet the whole ranch on it, but I'd bet a good part of it that that's not a likely outcome. All right, Liz, let's go to paid leave and all the nuances there. And
all right.
We've allocated 8 minutes for an hour discussion, so go ahead.
Exactly. Let me how quickly I can get through this. So we have been working with a number of clients on, of course, we've done the training on. It's one thing to do the deck on how do you count it. It's another thing, how do you implement it? And when you're actually in it day to day, we've had some compliance challenges that we've worked through with a number of our clients, and we figured we'd go through them with you today to kind of, learn as we're learning on some of these pieces. So the first thing is to remember that the coverage of whether or not you are required to provide both the paid sick and the extended family. It is private employers with fewer than 500 employees. And you might have looked at your workforce previously when all of this first started and you were above the 500 and you don't have to worry about that. But if you have done furloughs, layoffs, reductions in force, you need to be looking at your workforce at the time the employee would take the leave. So you can't rely on the snapshot you took when this started. You need to be monitoring whether or not you are covered on a regular basis, because not only do you have to worry about when somebody asks for it, but there are notice requirements. There's other pieces of of coverage that you could potentially not be in compliance with if you are not monitoring your workforce. And a key thing to consider here, obviously full-time and part-time employees count. What's interesting is where this differs from some other laws is part-time employees count as a full employee. So it's not a partial, it's not two part-time people make up one whole. They are a whole, so count them as a full person. Any people who's on leave, they count. But furloughed and laid off do not count. And again, this is where we differentiated your count from the WARN. Also, another thing that I know people are thinking through and adding is your day laborers provided by a placement agency. So if you have temporary workers in there, they are going to be counted. Your independent contractors are not. So that's a dance. So make sure you are real time looking at your numbers. The next issue that we have on the next slide,
No, good.
So the next issue is on the compensation rate. It is not their current wage rate. You're not compensating. The regs say, depending on the type of leave, they're either paid at their average regular rate or 2/3 of their average regular rate. Well, what is that? It is not necessarily their current wage. So what it is a look back for the shorter of either a 6-month period or if they've been employed less than 6 months, it's their entire employment. And if you look at what their earnings were, the average across that time. So for example, if you have just done a 20% reduction in wages, they are not paid at that 20% reduced rate. It is the average. Their higher prior rate does come in. It's the average. Similarly, so it could also benefit you if right before COVID hit, you rolled out wage increases, the merit increase cycle went through. They're not paid at that higher rate. Again, it is the average regular rate over the preceding 6 months or their employment. And there's a detailed discussion in the FAQs about how to do that average and how to pull in the numbers for the last 6 months. But this is a piece that we are definitely seeing employers, struggling with and just automatically making the payment at their current wage rate. Another pause point there, and we won't go into this because I could do a day on this, is for your non-exempt or employees, look at their regular rate. Are you paying bonuses? Are there other non-discretionary funds that need to be cycled in? Actually, it's applicable to your exempt workforce too. So it's not an easy calculation. No,
this is something that I think a lot of people are not aware of at all. So as we go to the next slide, and thank you also for you've given the link to one of the Q's and A's, because this has been detailed a little bit in the DOL's workup in Q's and A's, and that's worth looking at too. All right, accrued leave.
Yep. So this is a little bit of a setup for the next slide, but just to refresh, So under the for leave covered by the emergency paid sick leave, you cannot require your employee to use their accrued leave. Essentially, the regs expressly say that this is leave that they are entitled to above what they already have accrued from their employers. Now, employees may elect to supplement their compensation with a proportional amount of accrued personal or sick leave. It has to be at the employee's election. Where this could come into play is, for example, for various parts of the leave that they only get paid 2/3 of their average rate. That is a piece of it. The other is there is a cap that the emergency leave. So employees who are earning above that cap, they can supplement their earnings, because when you do use the accrued personal leave, that is paid at their normal rate. So it's a difficult calculation, again, to do what is a proportional payment rate, but you can allow them to do that. And then under the Family Medical Leave Act, employers can require concurrent use of accrued personal leave, not sick. So some of the dance here comes in is, do you have a single bucket of PTO? If you have a single bucket of PTO, then you can allow them to use that. If you still have buckets of vacation and sick, then the only bucket you can touch here is the vacation, the personal leave bucket. You cannot mandate that they go into that sick leave bucket. And again, those leaves, when it's run concurrent, they are paid at their current full day's pay. So then we're struggling on the next slide. This is where it becomes very nudgy, it's the legal term, I think, is how to do the dance when you have an employee who is taking leave to care for a child due to school closure. Because one of the issues is, and again, I'm sorry, what I forgot to mention on the last slide is the concurrent use of leave has to be in a pre-existing policy. So you had to have a policy on the books previously that said under FMLA, you were required to take your accrued leave concurrently. So now we have the overlap for childcare. They get 12 weeks of paid under the two different provisions. Under the family leave, it's 12 weeks, but the first 2 weeks are not paid. So then that gap filler is the emergency paid sick leave. That pays them for those first 2 weeks. So you get 2 weeks at 2/3 of your average rate. Be careful here, folks, because you cannot mandate the use of accrued leave during those first 2 weeks. That's where some of the issues are coming into play in the implementation of it, because they're saying, oh, it's family leave, we're going to mandate concurrent leave, and that's not permissible under this. You need to be very careful for those first 2 weeks. You may allow them to take some of their sick leave to supplement their income. You have to be very careful about how to do that and how to calculate that you're not running afoul of the prohibition on using accrued leave during a paid sick leave coverage. And another thing to think about, and we've had employers struggle with this, is their existing, so during the weeks 3 through 12, say an employee does not have any personal leave, but they have sick leave accrued. Are you going to allow them to dip into their sick leave bucket, their option, you can't require it, their option to cover for their family leave? If your policies allow for it, great. Many of our employers, many of our clients are finding that their policy does not allow for the use of sick leave for non-sick leave related issues, and they're not wanting to set that precedent and setting that going forward. So you have to realize that if you start allowing that under these circumstances, you need to put some strong guardrails in and policy restrictions, or choose not to do so. And that is something that many employers are grappling with, is whether to expand the use of their sick leave to non-sick leave related reasons to allow full compensation.
Terrific. Thank you, Liz. And thank you for covering a lot of material in a very discrete amount of time. Well, our time has run for this week. We really want to thank everyone, and I particularly want to thank both Liz and John for a lot of really substantive information. I hope everyone participating today, we will be recognizing Memorial Day, one of our most important holidays as a nation, next Monday. But we will be back here on June 1st. And all indicators are there will be a lot of information and developments to report at that time. So thank you. And Adriana, I'll turn it back over to you.
We'd like to thank you for joining us today. As a reminder, you may view the previous weekly briefings on our website at www.FortneyScott.com. And all registrants from today have been registered for future weekly briefings. Be on the lookout for additional updates, which will be sent via email. Later today, you will receive a survey requesting feedback for today's presentation. You are able to submit suggestions for future topics through the survey, of course. And as David noted previously, because next Monday is Memorial Day, our next briefing will be the following week, which is on June 1st. Thank you in advance for completing the survey. And of course, if you have any questions, you may submit them via email to info@FortneyScott.com. We will see you when we return on June 1st.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.